Hello, Year 8, and welcome to our next lesson on citizenship. So today what we're going to look at are two main themes, really. The first is our liberties. So a liberty is your freedoms. So we're going to look at your rights and your freedoms, and then we're going to look at voting in more detail. And we're going to continue our work on that idea of enfranchisement, so when people get the vote, and whether actually enough people do have the vote. So first I'm going to look at this idea of our rights as citizens of the UK. So we have a Human Rights Act that was signed in 1998. And we've got to think about what rights we have. Now, when we think about rights, and this is an idea we've talked about before, we need to think about the fact that we are individuals, so we have individual rights, but actually we don't live on our own. We don't just operate in this island on our own. We are actually part of the community. So some of those rights we have to balance out with the needs of all people in society. So just to recap on some of our previous learning. So what we looked at in our last lesson was this idea that we've changed from a monarchy, remember, where you just have a king or queen in charge, to a democracy. So a democracy is where people have certain freedoms, and one of those freedoms is the freedom to vote. Now, democracy in its simplest form means that you have the right to vote, but actually in a democracy, we call it a liberal democracy, you actually have certain rights that come with that as well. So it's not just purely about this idea of voting, you get lots of other rights as well. So like I said, these are all part of what we call the Human Rights Act that was signed in 1998, and it put in law what our rights are as citizens of the UK, as part of this liberal democracy that we live in. So like I said, I'm just going to go through some of these main rights that we have. The first one is the right to life. Now, I know that might sound silly, but actually it's a really important right. You have the right not to be killed. And that's by either another individual or by the government. And of course, sadly in society, sometimes people break those rights, but actually you have that fundamental right. In some countries, people don't have that right. The government can basically do what it likes to people, but we don't have that. We have rights. Another key idea is this idea of freedom from torture. So you cannot be tortured by another individual, you cannot be tortured by the government. So our government has to give people a fair trial, it has to have certain conditions even when people are imprisoned. Whereas, again, in some countries, that's not the case. The government might actually torture people. Another important right is the right to a fair trial. So if you are on trial, you should be judged by your peers, by a representative of society, and that should be a fair trial. So, for example, they need to look at the different ethnicities of the jury, and they need to look at the different age demographics. So, if all the jury were people plus 70, well, actually, that's probably not a fair trial, because actually that's not representative of all society. We also have the right for freedom from slavery and forced labour. So you cannot be a slave in this country. You have to get fair pay for your work. And obviously there are certain conditions that all employers have to follow. Next is the protection from discrimination. And this is where we talk about, obviously we are a community and therefore we have to work with people. So we all have the right to be protected from discrimination. So, and I know we've done this in our previous lessons where we've talked about this idea of freedom of expression. Well, actually, we can't just say what we like in society because it might have an impact on somebody else's rights. So we actively avoid discrimination. And we talked about discrimination being either that kind of verbal or physical abuse of someone. Next, we have freedom of expression. So we can say what we like to an extent. Remember, some people confuse freedom of expression with basically saying what you like. That's not actually what it means in law at all. It means you have the right to express your views, but those views cannot be hate speech. They cannot be forms of discrimination because that's not acceptable, because we have to work as a society. People don't live on islands on their own. We have the right to an education. So in this country, we are provided with an education up till the age of 18 for free. So that's a really fundamental right that actually, if you're going to improve as an individual, you know that education is an extremely and the most important tool to do that. We have the right to free elections. Now, what free elections mean is that you can vote for who you like. So in a ballot box, we have in this country, it's secret, so no one can see your vote. You don't have to put your name on it. So it's a free election. No one is forcing you to vote one way or the other. In some countries, the governments have these elections, but they're rigged. So basically, the government forces you to vote a certain way. There'll be men stood there with guns, basically forcing you to vote one way or the other. We don't have that. We have free elections. We also have freedom of thought. I know that might seem a simple one, but actually you can think what you like, basically. We also have this belief and freedom of belief and freedom of religion. So anyone can choose to be whatever religion they like in our society. And we are a multi-religious society. We have lots and lots of different religions. You can also choose not to be religious if you like. And finally, we have the right to liberty and security. So we have the right to feel secure. And this is where this idea of working as a community comes together. So people can't just do what they like because there's laws about that. We want people in society to feel secure in the society that they live in. Okay, so what you need to do now is you need to go to the Google form and you need to answer the questions on those rights that we have in the United Kingdom. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to consider, should the voting age be lowered? So in the previous lesson, we looked at the fact that obviously women got the vote after the First World War. We looked at the fact that the voting age has lowered over time. So in 1969, it was reduced to 18. Now there is some calls that actually it should be lower than that. It should be 16. So people, when they're in year 11, should be able to vote, because people would argue, well, actually 16-year-olds are just as intelligent as people who are older. So why shouldn't they have the vote? Why shouldn't they be enfranchised? So there's arguments for and there's arguments against it. So if I just go through some of those arguments for lowering the voting age first, and then I'll go through some of the arguments for maintaining the voting age at 18. So the first one is that many 16-year-olds work and pay taxes, and therefore they should be able to vote on how that taxpayers' money is spent. So if you're paying tax, if you have a job, part-time job at 16, you'll be paying tax. And actually, why shouldn't, therefore, you have decisions about how the government spends taxpayers' money? That's a big thing the government does. Another big argument is that at 16, you can legally get married, you can legally join the army, and if you're mature enough to do those things, if you're mature enough to go and fight for your country and potentially die for your country, why shouldn't you therefore have the vote? Another argument is that while some might disregard the youth and think that people aren't interested, I know that actually many 16-year-olds are very politically active, whether that be about climate change or lots and lots of different issues. You just have to watch the Haraway cast every week to show how politically motivated our year 11s are. So actually, if they're going to take part in marches and protests, then actually they should deserve to have a vote about who's in charge of the country. Another one is that the issues that politicians have or make have a direct impact on the lives of 16-year-olds. They have a direct impact on everyone's life. So, for example, I'm going to use it a bit later, it could be argued, well, actually, the decisions the government make are going to impact the 16-year-olds more than people, let's say, over 80. So when a government makes a decision about climate change, for example, that's going to impact 16-year-olds for a longer period of time. Now the arguments against. So some would argue that 16-year-olds aren't mature enough to make those decisions. They're still children, they haven't got enough life experience, and therefore it might lead to irresponsible voting. They might just tick a box regardless and not put much thought into it. Some argue that many 16-year-olds, I disagree with this, are not interested in politics, that the turnout rate for younger voters is sadly much lower than older voters. So therefore, is there actually much point in giving 16-year-olds if a lot of the 18-year-olds don't vote? Surely 16-year-olds won't either. Many children pay tax, at a younger age than 16. So every time you go to a shop and you buy something, remember you're paying VAT. So if we're going to give it to 16-year-olds, why not give it to 11-year-olds? Because they all pay tax. So that argument, some would say, is a weak argument. And voting is a huge responsibility. And with all the other pressures that teenagers have to deal with, it might be considered a burden. So it'll be your GCSE year, you'll have lots of other things to worry about, getting places at college. So actually having to vote as well might be something that people don't want to do. So what I'd like you to do is to write a paragraph using the structure I'm about to provide for you on whether you think 16-year-olds should have the right to vote or not. So at the moment, obviously, lots of you are disenfranchised. You don't have the vote, so that's not a right that you have at the moment. So actually, should 16-year-olds, so by the time you get to 16, should you have that right? So we know we've been working on our kind of paragraph structure, and we know we've also been working on using various types of sentences, because we want your writing to be more than just a collection of simple sentences. So what I'd like you to do with the paragraph, first you're going to have an introduction stating whether you believe the voting age should be lowered or not. So here we've got, there are many reasons that the government should lower the voting age in the United Kingdom. The current voting age in the UK is 18 and has been since 1969. So that's an introduction. Now, if you're arguing for the against side, obviously what you'd put, there are many reasons the government should not change the voting age. Then I want to give you a reason. So why do you believe that? And remember, when we're talking about why we believe something, it's always good to use because. So that's subordinating conjunction. Why? Because. So the government should lower the voting age because issues that politicians decide directly impact the lives of 16-year-olds. And in some cases have more of an impact than on older generations. You'll see there I've used an and as well because I want to mix up my sentence types. Then you give an example to support your view. So for example, any decision that the government makes on climate change will affect the younger generation more than the older generation. I'm trying to be persuasive, so I want to give examples to help persuade. And then a conclusion with a therefore statement to link back. So therefore, surely it is right in a democracy that 16-year-olds are enfranchised. Now, what I want to do here is we've got that word democracy and we've got that word enfranchised. We know those two words, so actually we need to upskill our vocabulary, so we need to be making sure we're using those words. Okay, so I now want you to go away and write your sentence. I've given you that kind of simple paragraph formation here, so I want you to use that. So make sure you use your because, make sure you use the word democracy, enfranchise, you know those words, use them. For examples, and making sure you're giving an example, and then a therefore, because it's always good to link back to the initial thread of your argument. So you want your argument to be coherent and a whole.